Good afternoon to all of you. So we'll start this session, and first talk is by Professor Oskar, and he's going to talk about interacting narrowbands of twisted bilayer graphene in magnetic field.
Okay, thank you again. So I'm going to continue where I left off last time. Last time I told you about what happens in magnetic field at large twist angle when the effects of Coulomb interactions are secondary, so that we still have the narrow bands, we still have the Dirac points, maybe strain. So strain will split the Dirac points in energy and it will move them away from the high symmetry points in momentum. And there were certain physical consequences of that, which I tied to an experiment from Stanford. That's one end of this spectrum. That's where the Coulomb interactions do not play the prominent role. And so now I'd like to go to the other end of the spectrum, which is what I covered at the end of the first lecture, namely the strong coupling limit and what happens to these strong coupling excitations in the external magnetic field. So I would like to unite those two now and go from one end to the other continuously. It's the idea. All right, so this talk is based on the work of Xiaoyu Wang, who was a postdoc, a Dirac fellow at the Magnet Lab, and it appeared this year in this publication. All right, so I need to start with some preliminaries. And so this is a famous formula. It's a thermodynamic formula that describes a filling of a gapped state in an external magnetic field. So imagine that you have an insulating state, it's gapped, then N here is the areal density of your carriers. The AUC is the area of the unit cell. And so for us, this would correspond to the Moret unit cell filling. Okay? So for example, if we're at charge neutrality point, and we were at zero external magnetic field, then this left-hand side would be zero. If we were depopulating the narrow bands completely, again, if we were at zero magnetic field, this would be -4. Okay? If we populate, it's +4. This phi here is the magnetic flux through the Moret unit cell. So external magnetic field B times the area of the unit cell. Phi naught is the flux quantum, so these are just fundamental constants. And then S and T are rational numbers which describe our state. So, for example, if we had a Chern insulator, it will have an integer value for T. And this T is also related to the quantized Hall conductivity. Okay? That's the famous relationship between this so-called thermodynamic formula and the transport formula in the quantum Hall regime. And then this S, you can think of this as the limit of magnetic field going to zero. So in the plots where I'm going to show you the density on the x-axis and magnetic field on the y-axis, this S will correspond to the intercept. The x, when y is equal to zero, it's the intercept with the x-axis. So if you had a Chern insulator, integer Chern insulator, then T would be an integer, and then S could be a rational number. Okay? If you had a fractional Chern insulator, then T would be fractional. Typically, S would also be fractional. Okay? So just to give you a feeling for how this works, let's consider the Haldane model as a toy model to study. And we're going to apply a small external magnetic field to this. So I'm sure all of you know this famous model. Imagine electrons hopping on a honeycomb lattice. They can have nearest neighbor hopping, but in addition to the nearest neighbor hopping, they can also have next neighbor hopping, and these next neighbor hoppings are complex so that the electron effectively experiences a flux which is on average zero, but otherwise non-uniform and non-zero through this unit cell. And so what Haldane discovered is that the spectrum of such a tight binding model will gap the Dirac points of the honeycomb lattice, and that this is actually a churn state, a topological state. So if we were to now expand in the vicinity of these Dirac points to leading order, we would find that this is described by a massive Dirac equation. So this M here would correspond to the gap that opens here, or 2M would be the gap that opens here. And then to leading order in the gradient expansion, you would find the linear term in K. Okay? This Hamiltonian is trivial to diagonalize, and including magnetic field, what we would find is that after the minimal substitution, or the so-called Peierls substitution, this term will have a lowering operator for the Landau levels. This term will turn into a raising operator for the Landau levels, where the length here is the so-called magnetic length, which again depends only on the fundamental constants and on the external magnetic field. So the smaller the magnetic field, the longer is this magnetic length. Okay, now this problem can also be easily solved, so you can solve for the spectrum. And the spectrum would look something like this. So the y-axis here is the energy, and on purpose I omitted the units here, it's not very important. The x-axis is the magnetic field. And what you discover, so let's say this is at valley K, what you discover is that each of these Landau levels has a particle hole partner. So this blue level has a partner here, the next blue level has a partner here, except for this special level at 0, which does not have a partner. And this plot here is for M chosen to be positive. Okay? So this anomalous level will attach to the top of the valence band. And it will not have a partner in the valley K from the bottom of the conduction band. Now, if this were a trivial insulator, not the Haldane insulator, not the Chern insulator, then in the other valley, if we choose this gauge, the mass would be opposite sign, and this anomalous level would then attach to the bottom of the conduction band. So if we were to place the chemical potential here in this gap, each of these levels will have a partner above and below. And so that state would then correspond to a precisely half filling of this lattice. And therefore, the total particle number necessary to sit inside of this gap would be independent of the external magnetic field. Okay? So that's what would happen in a trivial insulator. So if we place the Fermi level inside of this gap, the gap at B equal to 0, then the number of particles that we would need to fill up to this gap would be independent of the magnetic field. In other words, the formula that I showed you would correspond to S equal to 1. Let's say these were spinless particles hopping on this lattice. So we would have 1 particle per site to be at half filling. 1 particle per unit cell, I'm sorry, to be at half filling. And then this T would be equal to 0. Because in order for us to sit in the gap, we do not need to change the number of particles as we change the flux. Okay? However, if this was the Chern insulator, then the other valley will have the same sign mass with this gauge. And this anomalous level would then attach also to the top of the valence band. And in this case, in order for us to sit inside of this gap, we will have to populate 1 extra Landau level compared to the case I just showed you before. Okay? So therefore, in order for the Fermi energy to sit inside of this gap for a Chern insulator, we have to adjust the total number of particles. Okay? So the total number of particles, the left-hand side, will be 1 plus flux through the unit cell divided by the flux quantum. Okay? So in this case, this state would be characterized by S equal to 1 and T equal to 1, T being the quantum Hall conductivity integer. Okay? Any questions about this? All right, so I'm going to use these S and T's to label the states that are observed experimentally in the magic angle twisted bilayer graphene. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief survey of the experiments which report the so-called correlated Chern insulators near the magic angle of twisted bilayer graphene. This is a plot from Ali Yazdani's group where they use scanning tunneling microscopy to measure the gaps as they change the filling and as they change the external magnetic field. So over here, that's the charge neutrality point. You see, there's a gap at charge neutrality point, and then there's a gap at s equal to 0, because this line will have a 0 intercept, so that's s equal to 0, but t equal to 1, t equal to 2, t equal to 3, and t equal to 4. Okay? Then there's a Chern insulator which develops above a critical field where the s is equal to 1, but the t is equal to 3. Okay? And then over here, this corresponds to s equal to 2, that's the intercept, and the slope here also corresponds to 2, so this is t equal to 2. This corresponds to s equal to 3 and t equal to 1. Similarly on the hole side. Okay? So on the electron side, the main sequence would then correspond to s plus t equal to 4. And then on the hole side, the s plus t would be equal to minus 4. In this experiment, the dots which they are showing correspond to the gaps as observed in the scanning tunneling microscopy. Now, they're not the only ones to observe this. This was seen quite universally. This is the data from Andrea Young's group. You can also see these Landau fans. This is the data from Pablo Harilo Herrera's group. Again, these are the Chern numbers observed there. This is the data from Ben Feldman's group at Stanford. They have scanning single electron transistor to measure the local inverse compressibility. So you can see this beautiful fan, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the T's. This is now S equal to 1, T equal to 3. You see it doesn't go all the way to 0. It starts at a finite critical magnetic field. This corresponds to S equal to 2, T equal to 2. And this corresponds to S equal to 3, T equal to 1. Okay, so it's basically the same data, same results. This is the result from Stevan Nachberger's group, Caltech. And this is the data from Dima Efetov's group. And they all essentially are seeing the same thing. Okay? So this is the main sequence. S equal to 0, T equal to 4, S equal to 1, T equal to 3, S equal to, let's see, so this is S equal to 0, T equal to 4, this is S equal to 1, T equal to 3, S equal to 2, T equal to 2, and then S equal to 3, T equal to 1. Okay, so that was close to the magic angle. Here's the data from Andrea Young and Corey Dean's group from fairly early publication, where they took a twist angle 1.27, which is away from the magic angle. I showed you this data before. The key there was that they applied pressure and they turned it to look like it's close to the magic angle. But now I want to go back and turn off the pressure, so let's focus on this gray curve. So in this case, you see they have a dip at the charge neutrality point, and they have a feature at nu equal to, at filling factor 2 at 0 magnetic field, maybe a weak feature at filling factor -2, but these are certainly not insulators. So we are still far away from the magic angle, okay? Nevertheless, they also see these Landau fans, so these are the ones which emanate out of charge neutrality point, but here, for example, these ones emanate out of nu equal to -2. So this would correspond to S equal to -2, T equal to -2. So it seems that you do not need to have a correlated insulator at 0 magnetic field for you to see some of these non-trivial Chern insulators at the finite magnetic field. Okay? And so now the question is, what is the nature of these Chern insulators? And in this field, there were two scenarios which were put forward. So the first scenario is related to what I was telling you about in my first lecture, namely that the narrow bands of the twisted bilayer graphene are topological, and that you can separate them out into a churn plus and churn minus basis. I showed you how to do that. I showed you a tool that you can use to do this, the so-called Wilson loops. Okay, and then similarly, in the other valley, you can also separate out the bands into a churn plus and churn minus. So now, if you include spin, you're going to have 8 such bands. 4 are going to be churn plus, and 4 are going to be churn minus. So one idea is that the way you would obtain S plus T equal to minus 4, or S plus T equal to 4, is that you would start selectively populating these bands. So for example, let's say that your S is equal to minus 4, and your T is equal to minus 1. That means that you need to put in 1 electron into the narrow bands, into a churn number minus 1 band. Okay? So that's going to take care of S equal to minus 3, because that's the first particle you put into the narrow bands, and then it automatically would have the right churn number. Okay? Now to go to S equal to minus 2 and T equal to minus 2, you put the next particle into the next churn minus 1 band. Okay? And you keep going until you come to the charge neutrality point, where you're going to populate 4 churn minus 1 bands. Okay? And then on the electron side, you then start populating the churn plus bands. Okay? And this is one scenario in which you could obtain the sequence which was observed experimentally. Okay? In other words, the idea is that the kinetic energy of these narrow bands essentially doesn't matter. Okay? What matters is that they are topological, and that you can decompose the Hilbert space into churn plus and churn minus, and then selectively populate these churn bands. So that's scenario number 1. Now, scenario number 2, which was advocated by several experimental groups, is not to think about it this way, but to think about it starting from a non-interacting picture. So imagine that we take our narrow band, we don't worry about this at all for a moment, and we turn on a magnetic field on this narrow band. What's going to happen is that these narrow bands are going to Landau quantize. So, for example, this would correspond to the Landau levels that emanate out of the top of this band, and this is their spacing. This here would correspond to the Landau levels which emanate out of the bottom of this band. And because there are Dirac points here, we have this famous 0 Landau level, which in this particular case would attach to the Dirac point. Okay? So now, what would be the churn numbers for these groups? So down here, if we were to place our Fermi level over here, so that the narrow bands would be completely empty of particles, the churn number would be 0. This is a trivial gap, trivial insulator. Similarly, if we completely fill the narrow bands, this would also correspond to churn number 0. Okay, so we have these two as our boundary condition. Now, if we also know how many 0 Landau levels we have here, because we just need to count the number of Dirac cones, and there are 8. So that means that if I go just above the charge neutrality point versus just below, I need to get a change by 8. And the way I get that is that this would be minus 4, and this would be 4. Okay? So for each valley and for each spin, this gap would correspond to minus 1, and this gap would correspond to plus 1. Okay? So if this is a churn number 0, and this is a churn number minus 1, that means that this group of states has to have churn number minus 1. Okay? And similarly, this group of states also has to have a churn number minus 1. So the scenario which was put forward by some of the experimentalists was that the way you would get, let's say, S equal to minus 3 and T equal to minus 1 is that at finite magnetic field, you simply populate this group of states. Okay? And that's precisely going to give you the correct S and T. This is very different than populating these states. This basically corresponds to strong coupling limit. This corresponds to the case where the bandwidth plays a prominent role, okay? And the interactions are secondary. So the question is, which one of these two scenarios is actually realized in the experiment, and how could one actually tell? So What we did with Xiaoyu, and when I say we, that means Xiaoyu, is a self-consistent Hartree-Fock calculation for twisted bilayer graphene, at first with no heterostrain, by changing the twist angle. So this plot over here has a large twist angle, 1.38, this is 1.32, down to the magic angle, in the Bicester-McDonald model. So the Bicester-McDonald model is particle hole symmetric, and therefore in these plots, I am only showing the whole side. Now, each one of these dots here corresponds to a Hartree-Fock calculation. So what is being plotted here is the size of the single particle gap at the Fermi level. So for comparison, the radius of this dot here would correspond to 10 MeV. So these actually correspond to sizable gaps. And these now follow the formula that I showed you before, the thermodynamic formula that I showed you before. So for example, over here, this would correspond to S equal to -3 and T equal to -1, etc. Okay, so at a large twist angle, you indeed see Landau levels which emanate out of the bottom of this band. And their degeneracy is actually split due to the so-called quantum Hall ferromagnetism. Similarly, we also see Landau fans emanating out of the charge neutrality point. They're also split due to the quantum Hall ferromagnetism. But otherwise, in between, there isn't much happening. This is too high of an angle for the system to turn insulating at zero magnetic field. The bandwidth is simply too large. However, if you look carefully, there is actually a set of levels where if you lower the angle, you start seeing that they protrude deeper and deeper until, at very low angle, they go to the lowest field we can access in our numerics. And these indeed correspond to the states we are interested in. I will discuss what happens when we approach the magic angle in these two cases as we go along. But at least in this part of the phase space, our results resemble quite a bit what you saw experimentally. All right, so let's focus on a fairly high twist angle, 1.28. So in this case, again, we see the S equal to -3, T equal to -1, etc. And the question is, what is the nature of these states? And the answer is shown in this plot. So I'd like you to focus on this bottom plot over here. So the band structure shown over here is the Hartree-Fock band structure in the absence of the magnetic field. Okay? So the angle is too high for the Coulomb interactions to be able to gap out the Dirac points. So instead what happens is that the bands are exchange split. And one of these Bicester-McDonald bands separates from the rest. It actually is not perfectly particle hole symmetric, and that's due to the interaction effects, despite the fact that the BM model's band structure is particle hole symmetric. So you see the exchange splitting between the Dirac cone of this red band and the rest of the bands. This corresponds, in this particular case, to polarizing the electrons in this red band to valley K and spin down so that the magnetic moment is aligned with the external magnetic field. Okay, now the rest of the bands now have a minimum over here, which get flattened by the interactions a little bit. And in order for us to be at the filling factor -3, we need to compensate the holes in this pocket with the electrons in these pockets. This is a compensated semimetal. This state is not an insulator. It's a compressible state. So that if we were to track this line down over here, we would not see insulation. This is as we should. The angle is simply too high. Now, if we plot the Landau level structure of our interacting calculation at a finite magnetic field, and we separate it by the same quantum numbers, so that the red corresponds to the valley K spin down, we see that we're indeed populating the lower part of the Landau level spectrum we would obtain from this red Dirac point. This would correspond to the 0th Landau level emanating out of this Dirac point, and this corresponds to the rest of them. There's some exchange splitting so that this gap is actually opened up a little bit more than it would have been by simple Landau quantization of this picture. But that's basically what's going on. Okay? And since this group carries a Chern number -1, once this is gapped, this corresponds to this t equal to -1. Now, the other valleys and the other spins will then have lambda levels that would correspond to this minimum, and they're shown here in the same color. So green and orange are sort of occluded, but you can see them emanating out of here. So now you can also tell why this is going to be compressible at low magnetic field. Because now imagine Landau quantizing this. You're going to get the 0th Landau level over here, and then you're going to get a square root of b, square root of n Landau levels coming out of this. But those Landau levels are going to be buried inside of the Landau levels which emanate out of this minimum. So you have to increase the magnetic field above a critical value until the gap between the 0th Landau level of this Dirac point and the first n equal to -1 Landau level opens up. And that's why this would actually terminate at low enough field into a compressible state. So that's how we understand this Landau fan over here. Okay. Now, if we were to consider -2, -2, it's a very similar story. In this case, we simply populate the red and the green that corresponds to valley K and spin down, so the magnetic moment aligned with the external field, and valley K prime, and again, magnetic moment aligned with the magnetic field. And again, we have a compensated semi-metal. The pocket over here is going to get compensated by this pocket over here. But because now we have twice as many Dirac particles as we had over here, you see this pocket has to dip deeper to compensate for it. Therefore, we need to increase the magnetic field further in order to be able to open up a gap. And that's precisely what's happening in this picture. You see the onset magnetic field that is necessary to go into an incompressible state is higher at nu equal to -2, so t equal to -2, than it is at t equal to -1. And similarly, at filling factor -1, so this one, it just simply corresponds to this exchange split semi-metal with now the pocket here dipping even deeper, and so you have to increase the magnetic field even further to be able to sit in this Chern -3 group of states. So this is our understanding of the high field results. High angle results. As we see, we do not need to consider the Chern nature of our bands to explain this sequence of Chern numbers. So this would correspond to the second, closer to the second scenario that I just showed you. All right, so I just showed you this. Now, however, if we lower the angle to 1.2 degrees and we look at the same thing, remarkably, we find that in order to understand the Landau level structure at the finite magnetic field, including the interactions, we have to consider the zero field as a gapped a Chern state. In other words, if you were to look at the previous picture, you see this had a Dirac point over here at 1.28, but if we now decrease the angle to 1.2 degrees, the bandwidth got smaller relative, and so the interactions are relatively more important, and they gap out this point. Okay? Now this becomes a Chern gap, which means that the state which is left over here has a Chern number -1. And if we look at the finite magnetic field Landau levels, we can trace them back to the Landau quantization of these bands. Okay? So what's interesting about this is that at filling factor -2 and at filling factor -1, these two states are actually metastable. We can stabilize them in Hartree-Fock by enforcing a specific symmetry, but there is a lower energy Hartree-Fock state, namely the intervalley coherent state. Nevertheless, at finite magnetic field, this is the stable state, and so is this. To understand these Landau levels, we have to think about Landau quantization of an otherwise metastable Chern insulator. Okay? So this is quite fascinating because this shows us that an external magnetic field is able to stabilize a churn state, which at zero magnetic field would otherwise have been only metastable. Okay? And so our understanding, for example, of this -2 state over here is now as a magnetic field stabilized and Landau quantized churn -2 insulator. Similarly, the state here at S equal to -1 and then T equal to -3, this one, equal to -3, we also understand it as a magnetic field induced, magnetic field stabilized churn state. Okay. Now, we can look not only at the spectra, but we can also look at the wave functions. So what is being plotted here is, first of all, spectra of various SNTs. So this would correspond to the vertical line at the charge neutrality point. This would correspond to the interacting lambda level spectra. And this is the corresponding density matrix. Now, each of these corresponds to a particular Hofstadter subband on the x-axis and particular Hofstadter subband on the y-axis for each valley and for each spin. So the fact that there are these off-diagonal elements means that this is an inter-valley coherent state. So our state at charge neutrality point and at churn number 0 at the twist angle 1.2 would be gapped and would correspond to a trivial churn insulator. Okay. Now look, interestingly, as we decrease the density, so we go to S equal to 0 and T equal to -2, we find that there is still inter-valley coherence in this spin down sector, but in the spin up sector, it actually looks more like a churn insulator. Okay. So the nature of the state changes completely. It isn't that we start with this inter-valley coherent state, Landau quantize it, and then just populate its Landau levels. The nature of the state changes dramatically. And similarly at 0 -4, we lose the inter-valley coherence and simply populate the churn bands that I showed you before. Similar thing happens at -2, 0. This corresponds to a trivial, topologically trivial state with inter-valley coherence. This would be an IVC state. However, if we go to filling factor -2, the one that I just showed you, you lose the inter-valley coherence, and instead you stabilize by magnetic field the zero field churn state. Okay? And the way we understand the state at -2, -1 is simply as a population of an extra lambda level of this state. So this would be actually a weak state. So that's how we understand this picture. Okay? The vertical line over here would be a churn 0 insulator with inter-valley coherence, but the -2, -2 line is a completely different state. It completely loses its inter-valley coherence and is a churn -2 state that's stabilized by the magnetic field. Okay? Okay, so now if we push to the magic angle, we go to twist angle 1.05, the spectrum looks very, very different. So in particular, the first thing that we notice is that if you start counting here, this is 0, -1, -2, -3, -4 is missing. However, in the experiment, it's present. Second, there is a vertical line here. Okay, the vertical line eventually terminates. That may be okay experimentally. This vertical line corresponds to, so the -2, 0 state corresponds to the inter-valley coherent state that we obtain in strong coupling. But this very, very strong -2, -1 line corresponds to depopulating a lambda level of this IVC state. This is a very prominent state in this calculation, but it's missing in the experiment. So at -2, -2, this line, see at low magnetic field, there's hardly a incompressible state over there. So it's very weak at low magnetic field. It's essentially populating or depopulating lambda levels of this IVC, but then it becomes very strong above a critical magnetic field. And there, it indeed would correspond to a strong coupling churn state. At -3, 0, this state would correspond to taking a churn +1 state and then with one lambda level depopulated. And then at, so I already told you what happens at -3, -1, that just corresponds to a churn 1, strong coupling Chern insulator, and then -1, -1. So this is this line over here. Okay, that would also correspond to a strong coupling Chern insulator. And the way you get that is you populate 2 Chern -1 bands and 1 Chern +1 band. Similarly, -1, -2 is a depopulation of a 1 lambda level. So this looks very different from what I showed you before at a larger twist angle. It also looks different from the experiment. So one conclusion that at least I reach from these calculations is that the bandwidth of the narrow band is likely underestimated in the Bissetzer-McDonald model, and that once the realistic interactions, once the realistic bandwidth is included, we're actually closer to this case in the absence of the strain near the magic angle. Okay. All right. Let's see, so how much time do I have? So let me quickly show you what happens when we perform these self-consistent Hartree-Fock calculations at finite magnetic field for all of these densities when we include the heterostrain. At larger twist angle, it looks very similar. At smaller twist angles, you start seeing deviations. I should remind you that the heterostrain increases the bandwidth. So now you should be going further from the strong coupling limit. And again, each of these dots is a separate Hartree-Fock calculation. So let me focus on this particular twist angle, 1.2, which I discussed before, and start with the non-interacting Hofstadter picture. So in the presence of strain, the Dirac nodes, as I told you before, move away from the high symmetry points in momentum space, and they will also no longer be degenerate. So they get split. And as a result, you get the 0th lambda levels coming out of the split Dirac cones to be down here. That's this red flat line here and this gray flat line over here. So this is the thing you would start with in the presence of the strain. We would then project our Coulomb interactions onto this basis and do Hartree-Fock with this. So the result of this calculation at this angle is shown here. This now includes the interactions at the prominent filling factors, which I showed you in the previous slide. So I just quickly show you at 1.2, sorry. At 1.2, that's this. And we're going to again focus on the main lines, s plus t equal to -4. The color coding here represents the color coding we would have gotten from, well, I'll show you this more precisely, but these levels here are related to the levels over here. The key point here is that at large magnetic field, we actually have valley polarization, but as we lower the magnetic field while not changing S and T, we actually acquire intervalley coherence. And in this particular case, because it's strained, the nature of this state is so-called intervalley. It's the incommensurate Kekule state spiral. All right. Similarly, at -2, -2, at low magnetic field, we acquire intervalley coherence, same at -1 and -3. But at 0, -4, we never acquire the intervalley coherence. It simply stays valley polarized. Well, the valley and spin are good quantum numbers at 0, -4. So now let me show you what would the density matrices for each of these states in the red region look like. So in other words, this would correspond to the higher magnetic fields in the basis of these states. So you can see we are mainly populating this lower branch. That's what this means. But there is also spillover into the off-diagonal terms. Okay? So the fact that this is basically white means that these states are weakly admixed, if at all, while most of it corresponds to these states. But there is a spillover. So there is some admixture of the other states. Now, if we take as our basis the result of the Hartree-Fock calculation at 0, -4, so the ones which emanate out of the charge neutrality point, then what we find is that the density matrices become essentially completely diagonal. Okay? So in other words, the picture here is that at charge neutrality point, we do not gap. The Dirac points are still present. They move away from the high symmetry points now, not just due to the strain, but also due to the interactions. These then get Landau quantized, and then if we use that basis to express this density matrix, we find that it's essentially diagonal. So we are populating the Landau levels below the interaction renormalized Dirac points. Okay. Now, what happens if we go to lower magnetic fields, so in this blue region, the density matrices now start looking like this, which means we are picking up the intervalley coherence. Okay? And this corresponds to this this corresponds to this incommensurate Kekulé spiral. So this is our picture for the strain case. The charge neutrality point doesn't gap. 0 minus 4 corresponds to the population of the Hofstadter spectrum below the interaction renormalized Dirac points. And then the same story happens for the other main SNT sequence at high magnetic field, but then at lower magnetic field, the intervalley coherence sets in. All right, so with this, let me just flash a summary in terms of this picture and maybe take your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Time for questions.
Nice talk. Can you show the Hartree-Fock band structure where it gaps out the Dirac point?
This?
Yeah. So I can see like there are two bands from K and K prime valley below the Fermi surface.
So which one are we looking at right now?
Yeah, the E.
E?
Yeah. Now my question is how the mass of the gap is sign of the gap is decided.
You mean by the calculation or by?
Yeah, in your calculation.
So we. So you're asking a technical question, or what is the sign of the mass?
And I'm asking like
this is a Chern state. This is a Chern -2 state.
Because both the bands are like from K and K prime valley, so why they have like same Chern number but not?
This is just how the gap occurs. So in this particular case, Chern +1 and Chern -1 would be degenerate states because this corresponds to zero magnetic field calculation. So they would be, by time reversal, they would be degenerate. So now, if we select the Chern -2 state, out of this, remember that's a metastable state, okay? And then we look at the stable Hartree-Fock ground state at finite magnetic field. We notice that we can assign these Landau levels to the spectra we would have obtained from the zero field metastable Chern state.
Okay, yeah.
So if this were the opposite Chern number, if this were Chern +2, this would look very different. You see, this really corresponds to Chern -2.
Okay.
Any other questions? Anyone else? If not, let us thank Oskar for the nice talk.